Welcome to Literacy Talks, the podcast for literacy leaders and champions everywhere, brought to you by Reading Horizons. Literacy Talks is the place to discover new ideas, trends, insights, and practical strategies for helping all learners reach reading proficiency. Our hosts are Stacy Hurst, a professor at Southern Utah University and Chief Academic Advisor for Reading Horizons, Donnell Pons, a recognized expert and advocate in literacy, dyslexia, and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, an elementary classroom teacher, author, and speaker. Now, let's talk literacy.
Okay, welcome to this episode of Literacy Talks. My name is Stacy Hurst. I'm the host, and I'm joined by Donnell Pons and Lindsay Kemeny. And we are here to talk about literacy. Today, we're actually going to talk about multilingual learners. Now, that is a newer term. I want to just tell you, they're previously known, and Donnell and Lindsay, you can agree with this or not. There have been so many acronyms for this population. When I began teaching, it was ELLs, and then it became ESL, which was English as a second language, and then ESOL, English for speakers of other languages, and now we're at ML. Did I miss any that you guys have heard? I don't think there's so many acronyms in education in general, but specifically here. But we think this will be a really important conversation. I'm going to start, if you two don't mind, with some statistics, and then we're going to have some discussion about how we can best address the needs of these learners. So as of 2021, according to the National Center of Educational Statistics, 10.6% of students are English language or MLs in our public school system. That equates to about 5.3 million students. 38 states saw increases in that population. And it ranges in the states too. And I think that makes sense to us. But if you would have to guess which state has the highest percentage of English language learners, MLs, sorry, I'm getting used to the new terminology. What state would you guess? Lindsay, would take a guess.
I don't know. What, Donnell, you were going to say something.
Texas.
You're right. It is Texas. And that they have 20% of their students in public schools that speak another language. What about the lowest states?
Iowa.
Not on the list of lowest states. Good guess, though.
Wow.
And we will leave in the show notes. There's a really great resource where you can click on your state and see how they're doing. The low states, the lowest is West Virginia at 0.8. And then we have Wyoming, Montana, Vermont, and New Hampshire all have less than 3% of their students. So along with Texas, New Mexico, Nevada, and California have high percentages. They're just under 20%. So lots of, now this statistic really kind of blew my mind. And I read this where did I read this one? Oh, the Handbook on the Science of Early Literacy. Here is the statistic, and this is from the U.S. Census Bureau. In 2003, they said this. By 2030, about 40% of school-age children will speak a language other than English at home. That kind of blows my mind, actually. Most multilingual learners immigrate before kindergarten or they were born in the United States. The most often spoken language other than English is Spanish. And as we have our conversation today, I think I'll just anchor it to Spanish speakers to give examples because of that fact. But I want to start by asking you guys a question about, one thing I do need to mention too. Less than 5% of teachers have training that's specialized for multilingual learners. And I'm careful the way I word that. I don't want to say teachers are not prepared to teach MLs. What I want to say is they don't have specialized learning, because a lot of what we're going to talk about today is the structured language and literacy approach, which works for all learners. But there are some special things we need to do to meet the needs of MLs. So have you two had any experience with students who are learning English?
Well, I imagine we'll kind of get into it as we start, this discussion, but, they have various needs, right? And they're all like kind of had different levels of proficiency in English. So it's considering that student and what they need.
Yeah, and your pre-service instruction, Lindsay, were those students addressed?
No.
Okay.
No. Is that what you were asking? Sorry.
Yeah, but that's okay. I didn't ask it directly. You're good.
Okay.
Donnell, what about you?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question and topic. And yes, I do work with a lot of students currently with what I do, working with adults for whom English is another language. I also, when I received my first teaching assignment fresh out of my master's program in teaching, I moved into a middle school setting where I would say a bulk, if not a majority of my students fit that category of students that spoke another language other than English at home. And English was for them another language. And I received absolutely no training. We discussed that I would more than likely have students in my classrooms. And most of what was discussed in my program were things like cultural inclusivity, sensitivity to different cultures, but nothing about language, which really was their primary concern because I was teaching English.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And that tracks with what I've heard from others as well. Now, I did not in my pre-service education. I do remember one day when phonics was mentioned, but the other area, I honestly don't remember learning a lot about students who don't speak English as their first language. I really don't have any memory of that. I did go on to receive my English language endorsement, and I learned a lot through that. I taught the English language development classes at my school. And for those of you who are familiar, those are students whose English language proficiency is low enough that they require extra instruction. So I really counted that as a blessing in my career to help me with this conversation, but also to learn about the needs of those students. So even though teachers, you don't have to have specialized certification, it's helpful, but I think there's a lot we can learn and anchor on what we already know about language and literacy development in our structured literacy instruction. So I was thinking today we could just frame our conversation around those aspects of literacy instruction and development, and how what are good practices for our students, and how we would specifically address the needs of MLs as we're doing that. So there are a lot of things let's start with phonemic awareness. What are some things that we would need to consider as we're teaching phonemic awareness in our classroom if we have MLs as well?
Well, I think a huge thing here is that the phonemes, right? Our phonemic awareness instruction, focusing on that phoneme articulation and the sound spelling wall. I mean, that's huge. And what better way to, help our students with the English language than to introduce them to the phonemes of the English language, and especially being aware of certain phonemes that they don't have in their home language, because those ones need, extra attention. There's things like, I was hearing another teacher talk about this, the sh phoneme is very different. And she talks to her students about you have that CH sound, ch, and really needs to do a lot of work in helping them push that out to turn it into that SH sh sound. So just things like that. And, and the more we can do to kind of be aware of the sounds that are different, the sounds that are in English that aren't in their home language.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And you talked about the sound spelling wall and starting with phoneme, not only recognition, but articulation. So as we're using Spanish as an example, we have 15 shared phonemes with Spanish. By the way, they don't have nearly as many phonemes in their language. So as a teacher of someone who is speaking Spanish, then I can take a look at a phoneme inventory. We will leave you resources. One is mylanguages.org. Color in Colorado is a great resource to help you know the differences for Spanish specifically, but they also have resources for other languages. But that would be an opportunity for a teacher to focus on the same phonemes you won't need to spend as much time on, but the phonemes they don't have in their language, to really emphasize and lean into articulation as well. And Lindsay, you talked about it when you used the ch example. But I'm thinking too of maybe R's or L's, and in Spanish and English, they're pronounced a little differently. Donnell, what would you add to that?
So I'm glad, Lindsay, that you answered this first, because it addresses the younger learner, and then I'm working mainly with older students now. And what do they need? The same things, which is, something that they always come to me for help. And the thing they're lacking is that nobody backed up instruction far enough to give them the foundation. So they've been guessing from watching TV. They try to mimic. And this is really challenging. And many of them present to me, they'll even bring to show me a certificate that they graduated from another language program. There are many of them around. Maybe it was through work they were given this program. They said, I got a certificate. I still couldn't do half of the things. How come this happened? That's really interesting. And it generally goes back down to same articulation. They weren't given that opportunity to really feel in their mouths where it would be, what are the sounds, what are the differences between a voiced and a voiceless. These things that are really important were lacking. And so it's just assumed, because you had that first primary language, that you understand all of that about your first language. Well, how many of us remember that about when we learned to speak, right, in a language? Not many of us. So the assumptions that are made with older learners, I think, are interesting. And that's one caution I would give about the phonemic awareness and sounds, is not to assume too much about what you think an older student knows. Likewise, like you were saying, Stacy, is to piggyback on what they do know from that first language about the phonemes and phoneme production in the first language. Likewise, oftentimes my students haven't been asked, how was your acquisition of your first language? Did you have any challenges with the sounds? That's never asked a lot of times. And many of them say, yeah, the first language was hard for me. That was a tip-off. Second language would need more support.
That's a really important point, because assessment is critical, and we need to have a sense of how they're doing in their first language compared to English. So with phonemic awareness, as long as they understand the task, you can test that using English words or words from their first language, but they need to understand the task. So that doesn't require new materials or different materials, just making sure that they understand what's required of them. And importantly, phonics too, as we move into that discussion as well, how well they can connect those graphemes to the phonemes in their first language will help them in learning English as well. Lindsay, you were going to say something.
Yeah. Well, I was listening to this webinar with this high school teacher, and she was just talking about that when she taught her MLL students, the sound wall, she said their reading and writing took off, and she would give them little personal ones that they could take with them to other classes. Right. And they were just like, oh, that's this. Oh, this word has this sound. It's, she was saying like, it's a very, not berry, and would point that out to them, and talking about, those upper, the high school students have their phones. So they record and erase all the time. They record themselves saying the sounds, they get them out, they look at their mouth. And I just thought that's really cool. And I think a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today, we can think about how they can be applied, right, to your space, Donnell, to the older learner. It's almost some of the scaffolds and things we need to do. It's almost easier, I think, in the lower grades, because we're doing this a lot anyway. We're starting with the basics, so I think it can be a little bit more complicated if you have an older student who is brand new to English.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. And technology would actually be a plus in that space because, like you said, Lindsay, chances are they have more interaction with technology and can use it. That's a good point. Also, a good time to remember that language development in the brain can always happen. We can always improve it, but we do have a window of opportunity, developmentally speaking, and it is right those ages between kindergarten and second grade that it's going to be easier to teach these concepts for students to learn these concepts than it will be later and to apply them.
And Stacey,
No, go ahead.
Just quickly to make sure in this space that when a student is working on sound production, that it's never presented that you're doing it wrong or it's incorrect.
Great. Yeah.
That's another thing we need to be careful about. It's different, and maybe it might need a little tweaking so that the pronunciation is clear enough that I understand you. But this idea that it's wrong or incorrect or should be done differently because of that, I think we need to be careful in this space when we're doing that.
Yeah. And I think that's where understanding as much as you can, you don't need to learn another language, but understand the differences between the two languages. I think we talked about this yesterday when we were having an informal conversation. But if a student spells the word fodder with a D, then we honor that in their language, in Spanish, that is how they would pronounce that sound because they don't have th in their language. So we would say, oh, you got all the sounds. And in English, this is how we spell it. And also really elevating those students because their brains are doing some really complex things that that most of our English language speakers as a first language really aren't required to do. Their cognitive load isn't as much. Great points. Also, when we talk about phonemic awareness, of course, the whole reason we focus on phonemic awareness is to move a student towards being able to read and spell fluently. And one thing that I noticed when I was teaching English language development courses at my school, we could not use programs that focused on reading and writing. We had to only focus on speaking and listening. I can say this safely now, but I broke those rules. I did focus on reading and writing as well. So keep an eye out for that. If you're required to use a program, you might need to supplement by focusing on that phonics piece. So what are some things that are good practices for any student when we're teaching phonics that would be specifically relevant for our ML students?
Routines. Like, don't underestimate that power of consistency. Helpful for all students, but also especially helpful for students that may be experiencing some type of stress or, some of our multilingual learners have migrated, and there's various reasons for that. They may have experienced political unrest in their country. There's all these different things. And having just this consistency where they know what's happening and where they go, I just think that, we just can't underestimate that.
That's fantastic. Yeah, Donnell.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, it made me think about when I was trying to learn another language and some of the situations I was placed in where that was not the way I was going to learn how to pick up that language. But it's also being familiar enough. Again, we don't have to be experts in their primary language of a student if it's a language we're unfamiliar with, but just having a general idea that language has order, it has rules, just like what you're teaching the student about English. There's order, there are rules. And so if you can be familiar with some of the patterns so that you can relate that for the student, because that's what we're going to be doing is teaching them the patterns. And then we're going to be starting with those patterns that have a lot of consistency statistically in the language. And then we'll move towards, obviously later when the student has a foundation, we'll move towards those things that statistically aren't as frequent in the language. But it's that pattern-based governing of how we put the phoneme and grapheme together.
Yeah, all brains are pattern seekers, right? Another important thing about English compared to any other language, most any other language, and again, I'm anchoring things to Spanish today, they have 27 letters of their alphabet in Spanish, and we have 26, and most of those are the same. Their difference is they have I'm gonna Enye. I'm confident my high school Spanish teacher is not listening to me, but I pronounced that correctly. But also some of the letters look the same. They're the same letters, but they represent different sounds in the language. But one thing that is, as we all know, complex about teaching phonics in English is that one letter can represent multiple sounds. Multiple sounds can be spelled different way with many, have multiple spellings. So even explaining that explicitly to a student, I think would help, especially those students who come from more shallow orthographies compared to English, which is pretty complex in that way.
Mm-hmm. And Stacy, just recognizing that right there is so comforting, particularly to an older student. And I'm sure youngers would feel the same way too, but particularly older students who've lived maybe, in the United States for a decade or more and still struggle with these aspects. They feel like, what's wrong with me? How come I'm not able to get this? And you explain how difficult that is when you lay out some of the basics of that. Then there's a real understanding of, boy, this was really hard and I didn't receive what I needed to be able to pick it up.
Yeah. Another thing is to just make as many connections as you can. One fun fact, the letter Y in Spanish is called Y, which means Greek eye. And when we teach the many jobs of Y, as we call it in the Reading Horizons method, and we teach how many sounds Y can represent, that will help them to remember that it can represent that I sound. I won't mention that they don't have the short I sound in Spanish. We won't address that right now. The other phonics aspect that I think of when I think of my ML students that I've had over the years is that ED suffix, and how to help them understand how to pronounce that is complex but doable, right? And it's complex even for speakers of English, but those are things to really emphasize. Also, the way we assess, again, is important to know what they know in their first language compared to English. And you know what? I have this student, we assessed using Acadience, and this student was not a native English speaker. Her first language was Spanish, and she never came up at risk on that screener ever. When they did her language testing, they found that she wasn't proficient enough in speaking and listening. So she ended up in my ELD class, which is how I noticed as the literacy specialist at the school that she was not comprehending. She sounded okay. She sounded fluent. She sounded like she was accurate, but she had no comprehension. So when we're assessing, it's really important that we're being comprehensive about this assessment. We're assessing phonics. Yes, we need to know how they can map those phonemes to the graphemes, but we also need to check to see if they're comprehending. So that moves us into the next area I want to talk about, which is vocabulary, which is huge for MLs, right? So what kinds of things would you think we need to really emphasize with our ML students when we're teaching vocabulary, teaching anything really with vocabulary?
Definitely pictures, right? The student-friendly definitions. There's a website called Wordsmith, and Smith is with a Y, SMYTH, and they have like a visual picture dictionary. And I also like to use that website just when I need, I'm like, okay, here's our vocabulary word. I need a simple definition for it. I can go to there and look it up. But they have a picture dictionary, which I think is great. And when you're teaching those words, if you do like a lot of like an action with the word, kind of miming to help them understand, if you can connect that word with other words, with similar meanings, that's going to help. I mean, this is going to help all your students, but it's especially important for those multilingual learners. The academic vocabulary. So I saw a teacher that I thought was really great because she had like the pictograms in her room, because they're going to hear some of that academic, those terms over and over, like explain, clarify, categorize. And she had up on her board, so she would have like the word clarify with an icon like of glasses, explain, and it's like someone talking, those terms that they're just going to see throughout their school experience.
I'm going to piggyback on Lindsay here. When I was working in classrooms where we had students, and this is middle and high school settings, again, older students, and many of them would show up, first of the year or even mid-year, and they had very little English. Many had very little English. And you think about right away, what are you trying to do for an older individual who also maybe comes to this country and they need English? They're thinking about work vocabulary typically. Well, for our students, it's school vocabulary. What do they need to function in a school? And so in a lot of those places in the rooms, we would place labels that were, if we had a majority of students with a particular language, then you would have it in that language and then also English. But labeling things and pictures were often on things. If we were at that level, we were using pictures. But to get them familiar with just language within the classroom, because that could be really daunting for a student. And then I always like to remind instructors, because I had a bunch of individuals who were helping with reading and teaching English to a lot of students, on the way to and from, when you would go, say you're going to go work with a group and maybe you move the group from one location to another, or it's an individual student and you're moving from one location to another, I said, use that as an opportunity to grow vocabulary. So you're touching the wall and you're repeating wall. The student will repeat wall. You're going to look at the floor, touch the floor. We would stairs, talk about stairs, anything we walked by. I also had somebody talk to me the other day, and I thought it was a fantastic idea. They're working in a high school where they have a high number of students who are learning English, and they have students take the opportunity to talk to adults using their English. And so those students have, either you put a pass, they're learning English. There's a little sign so that they don't get called out. What are they doing in the hall? Why are they talking? It's like a little colored dot so they know, oh, this student is learning English. And then they encourage them, and they get so many points for trying to have an English conversation with an adult. So it'd be teacher, administrator who's in the hall. That is a great idea too.
Yeah, and providing a lot of opportunities for students to have those conversations. I think just oral language development in general. Another thing in the way of vocabulary instruction is with anything, you want to provide students enough practice opportunities. And that includes speaking and listening as well as reading and writing. So I think that's a really important thing to emphasize and to provide opportunities for them to do that. One thing I know I tried to change in my practice, and this is a really good example of something that's good for native English speakers as well, but just answering in complete sentences, something that simple, requiring that of your students. What color is this picture or this object? Instead of just saying blue, say that ball is blue, or, and if somebody's learning English hesitates in being able to do that, then give them a stem, start them off, say this ball is, and they can say blue, and then have them repeat the sentence. So that helps build speaking and listening vocabulary along with, like you talked about too, Lindsay, academic vocabulary that they're more likely to see when they're reading and spelling. Good points. What else with vocabulary? Because vocabulary is big. What about in the way of morphology? Okay, clearly we have lots to say about that. So when we're talking about meaningful word parts, and Donnell, I paused because you brought this up yesterday when we were talking, but cognates, right? There are 30 to 40% of all words in English have a related word in Spanish.
Shared cognates.
Yeah, so focusing on that. Another example that I read about, for example, the prefix im means the same thing in English and Spanish. So just really focusing on those common parts of language. Anything to add to
I think that's something that I think is surprising too. And once you start to do a little more reading on teaching English and understanding other languages and their relationships and what's similar, what's different, is that you understand there's a lot more shared about how we get to meaning of words in languages rather than they are different, right? There's a major difference in that a lot of our English words are not feminine and masculine, which some languages do have, right? And in fact, I find oftentimes my students are greatly relieved because they're like, oh, great, I don't have to worry about that. That's pretty awesome. But then you introduce them to all the other things about English and they're like, oh, maybe I'll take that back. But those are kind of interesting points too, to have conversations with folks about shared understandings of language. Isn't this interesting? This is unique. Isn't this is different?
Yeah. And I think having those conversations with, like you said, with our students too, because something like dialogue may be interesting for them to understand as well. If they're probably most of their day is spent speaking and listening and interaction, basic interpersonal, I forgot what we called them, BICS, basic interpersonal communication. But then you have the language of the classroom too, the academic side of it, which like with dialogue, seeing that in print, also becoming familiar with differences in their language in print, right? Like in Spanish, I'm thinking of the question mark that goes before the sentence and after, and one is upside down. And then they don't have quotation marks. They also mark dialogue a little differently in Spanish. So when we're teaching, and I think I moved us into the area of writing, but maybe syntax or semantics as well. Those are important things to know.
If you're wondering where to find proven, outcome-focused ways to put the science of reading into practice, you're in the right place. Reading Horizons Discovery is the evidence-based foundational literacy program educators asked for and helped create, with integrated components emphasizing phonics, phonemic awareness, high-frequency words, and rapid assessments that make grouping and individualized instruction easy to manage and deliver. This is the program that makes literacy instruction streamlined and more successful for teachers and students alike, so all learners can achieve reading proficiency. Go to readinghorizons.com/product guide to download the complete program details today.
And Stacey, you're kind of touching on something Stanislaus Dehaene talked about, and we'll put a link to this because it's a free video on YouTube, which I think is amazing. The Reading League, it was where he spoke at a conference in San Diego, April 2024. It was really good. If you can't tell, I think it was amazing with the enthusiasm in my voice. But one of the things that Stanislaus talked about, and I thought it was really interesting, is he said there needs to always be careful guidance of the visual attention to how we read also in whatever language it is. So it's pointing out to somebody who's learning English, the top to bottom, left to right nature of how we read and how to carefully move through a sentence and the things that are important. Just like you're talking about looking for that question mark at the beginning, at the end might be in another language, but yet quotation marks are not, but not assuming that we know these road marks and making sure those are taught with intention like the other pieces are.
Oh, I love that. Something I wanted to mention as you were talking, brought it to mind as well. I know when we have these when we're focusing on students who are learning English, we expect them to be a year behind their peers at best, right? And I think we need to stop that. Lindsay gave a great session at a conference that I was able to listen to, and having high expectations, not only for our students, but for our teaching, and being able to support those differences, whether it is in print or speech. And no, we cannot accept like that year lag is not normal. Like that can't be normal. We can close the gap, especially easier to do if they're younger, right? But as we're talking about focusing on things like syntax, which could keep a child back, a student behind, because it would interfere with their comprehension, right? If we're not attending to those things. So syntax becomes an important thing to address. And Donnell, I know you have taught a lot about syntax over the years, but I know it's different in different languages. Have you had the opportunity to highlight that with your students?
Yeah, and in fact, we've taken to using a little sticky notes in different colors to represent different parts of speech in a sentence, so that it's almost like being able to pull down a sort of representation of a sound when you're working on sound work with a student to have a visual representation, but you're also doing the same within a sentence to make sure the students understand the function of that word within a sentence and where it goes. This can be a really great activity for students where the syntax is different. Oftentimes, maybe the action comes before the noun or the subject of the sentence. And so when you have a color to represent rather than a word, you can talk about, well, so this is the noun or the subject. It's going to be here. The action would come here. You can have a conversation. Oftentimes that gives the older student and students of different ages an opportunity to not be concentrating on the words themselves, but rather the concept of what you're trying to teach them about how you order the word. So that's just a little thing we stick in, and then we'll move on to adding the word into that sentence and build from there, and doing simple sentences that just might have the subject, the verb, possibly an object. But that's a great way to break it down. Again, it's just like when you're teaching reading, down to the base concept and building from there.
And one resource that can help with that is the Syntax Project. I think it's the syntaxproject.org, I think. And it's really nice because it has these pictures for you, and you're kind of teaching them the basics of a sentence. So we start first grade, it starts with a who and a do. And what's the who and what's the do? And then it will have just pictures there. And the students, we determine together what's the who, what's the do, and now put that in a sentence. And then after, time with that, then you're going to add in a where or, a why. And so, so I had a student last year who had just brand new to English. He hardly knew any English. And so he would go, like, if it was a picture of a dog jumping, he would say, dog jump. When it's time to put it into a sentence, that's all he could do. And so I can go there and I can model and I can say, and have him echo the dog. And he would say, the dog is jumping, is jumping. The dog is jumping. And then he could echo, the dog is jumping. So just like break it down. Now, some of your students, you might be able to, if they can't put it together in a sentence, you might be able to just say the whole sentence and then they do it. But as an additional scaffold is to break it down. The dog is jumping. And you could add it on. So you could go, the dog is jumping. They echo. The dog is jumping over the fence, and gradually add a little bit more onto that sentence. So just thinking of those scaffolds that, this activity, like in my first grade, it's going to benefit everyone, but not everyone is going to need that level of support. So it's an activity that everyone can do, but you're giving more support and more scaffolds to the ones who need it.
And always with the focus on comprehending it, right? And helping in that way. I'm also thinking, how awesome to start on that sentence level. And again, this is a great example, good for all learners. Even if you've been speaking English, it's helpful.
And Stacy, this points out with Lindsay's example, the real challenge of the older student who comes to this country for whatever reason. You're here, and maybe you have very little introduction to English, and you're in a middle school. Right. So think about, this is fantastic. Lindsay's talking about this great opportunity in a first grade classroom. But this student sitting in a 9th grade English class, this is one of the things we do here to students that is really harsh, is they might get a little bit of time in a separate classroom if they're lucky to get some English introduction, but they're expected very quickly to then show up into a 9th grade English classroom. Wow. Right. Think about that. It's just, we ask a lot.
Yeah, it's true. It's very true. What are some other ways, and probably this is the big emphasis at the end of the podcast episode here, what are other ways we can support comprehension for our ML students?
Well, I heard a term that was new to me that I really liked, text engineering. Have you guys heard that? I really like that term, text engineering, and talked about you don't always need to simplify the text. Like sometimes we talk about, let's get a simpler version that has the same type of content. You don't always need to do that. You can engineer the text. So you can chunk it. You can put it into little chunks. And you can embed pictures. Like if it's digital, right? I'm thinking of upper elementary too for that. But if you could add in captions or visuals, you could have them listen. If you're going to read a story, could they listen to the story in their home language before you read it in English? That would be really helpful too. the idea I saw also with the text engineering that I thought was neat. Let's say it's a nonfiction story or that they need to read, and they have captions. Well, before they read, they would have them create questions based on the text features. So they would create those questions, and then when they read it, their questions could be answered while they're reading it. So I just thought it was neat. I hadn't heard of that before, text engineering, and I just liked the idea of that. But just think about those texts. They're complex. What can you do to break it down and help? What scaffolds can you help, use to help that student understand it?
I love that.
So again, I'm going to hark back to that Stanislaus video because it was so good. But so you'll really want to watch it on YouTube is what I'm saying. But he talked about this too, which was really interesting. And he talked about the joint importance of decoding and comprehension. And he made a really interesting point. And again, this might be another discussion we could have for a podcast because I think it would be very interesting. But on sort of a graph that he drew of the sort of optimal, or you're having a good experience with learning to read and write, he shows this graph and he gives the first 6 months to a year of instruction to decoding. And yet he shows comprehension fanning over the entire graph. So that's how he overlays. So I'm giving you 6 months to a year to learn the decoding system, to get the patterns down. And then you're getting this entire lifetime of comprehension, which is really interesting. I thought it was interesting to think about. But then you talk about, what about this individual who didn't learn to decode? That maybe they have dyslexia or whatever other reason. Decoding was very challenging for them. They didn't get what they needed. And that you cannot make up for by pretending it's not there. In other words, you can't sit a student down in 9th grade with a 9th grade text and they have the reading capability of 5th grade and expect that that's going to turn out okay. And so he had an X mark through sitting down students with text they can't decode, because then they'll just guess and use all kinds of other unproductive, means in which to try to get to that text. So that means, like Lindsay's saying, all these other ways in which we help a student to be able to reach the demands of the text where they're at, while still ensuring that they have the ability, that they're learning how to decode, right? And whether that takes, how much time that takes, depending on the challenge, we need to be aware of that. So that's what I think about in the middle and high school and adult space, is providing opportunities for individuals to meet the demands, their literacy and comprehension demands where they're at, while at the same time honoring the desire and the need to still learn to decode so they can do that on their own. So that, for me, in that older space, when you're talking about, hey, what can I do to support? That's a lot of things like Immersive Reader that Microsoft has. These programs that I can either input the information that I would like read to me, and with pictures too, opportunity for vocabulary, to interact with vocabulary, so I can meet the demands of what's being asked of me, while still honoring that I would like to pick up decoding skills, and I can, as we know that I can if I'm taught correctly, to be able to do that.
Yeah, and we can focus on that no matter if we're on the word level, if we're on the sentence level, if we're on the passage level. And I think, thankfully, we do have technology that will help the teacher too. So if I'm teaching a word like cat to my students, just something even simple, then I could translate it into another language. And so they can make those connections. It does feed into that lexical quality idea. The more a student knows about the word, including the meaning, will help them to get it in their long-term memory faster. So all of those things come into play there.
And, Stacey, you're talking about comprehension here, and I just have to add, because it's something that's happened within the last few weeks. In the evenings, my son has taken, and mind you, he now reads really well. I think I've said before he has dyslexia, and boy, did that take years and years and years and years and years to be able to help him. But we finally got there, stumbling along because I didn't have the information I needed. So hopefully a lot of folks have what they need today. But one thing I think is really interesting is that he's been coming in regularly. He has a book he's really enthused about. It's about screenwriting. He's really enjoyed it. And he is doing the thing that I did with him when he was young. I love seeing this. When he was young, because he couldn't reach the text, but he had the ability to comprehend far better and to be able to get into a text than he could decode. And so we would read. He would do his own reading and practice, but then we would read a text of a higher level to him and then have engaging conversation. I mean, since he was little. Well, I've noticed that that's something he's now reverting back to. Yes, he'll come in and read the text to me. And in fact, it was funny because he shared the book with me and he says, I can see you're not going to get around to reading this. so why don't I just start you off? Which I thought was so great. So he starts reading and it's beautiful. And he does his read, and then he'll stop and he'll do a little reflection. Well, what do you think about? And we have a nice conversation. And I realized we're doing exactly what we did when he was young, but he loved that, right? So if you really get a student into having comprehension and understanding that they can take a text apart, there's such joy there that will carry them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you were talking, it just made me think of the importance of, like Lindsay said at the beginning, procedures and routines and just being repetitive will be helpful. The other thing I think they will need, just like, because you're talking about your son who has dyslexia, but wait time becomes really important when we're asking a question or requiring a response of a student. I know that I learned things when I taught that ELD class, like in my own enunciation. And I have a tendency sometimes to start talking really quickly, and I'm using a lot of hand motions, which could be distracting. So I consciously had to slow down when I was talking and making sure that I was very clear in the way I pronounce things. Little things like that will end up helping all of those processes. And I think the other thing I learned when I got my, what was at the time, EL endorsement, is for any lesson you're teaching, any lesson, have a language objective as well. And that would serve all of our students, right? And with structured literacy, thankfully, they always have a language objective, but to really focus on that and help bring that out in our ML students, I think would be so helpful. And then Lindsay, just to highlight this, just at the end of our podcast episode here, yesterday when we were talking about this, you used the word celebrate. So I want you to say more about that.
Yeah, I was just saying, this is really something to celebrate, these students who have multiple languages. What an amazing advantage for them that's going to carry them and be so helpful throughout their lives. So I think, our attitude towards it can be really positive, and let's support the home language and in their learning English, because it's just, I just think it's amazing. And when I hear my students, speak in another language and then also hear them speak in English, like I marvel at it. I'm just, oh, that's amazing. I wish I could do that. So really, it's something to celebrate. And I think also we need to, we want to create that in classroom environment, that positive, welcoming environment. And by celebrating them, I saw a teacher that would hang the different flags from different students' countries up. She had a map up in her room, and everyone got to put their name on the map. And I thought that was really neat. But don't draw attention to the student without, like, in front of everyone else. Like, be cautious of that, unless they want to say something or talk about it. But I just think we can think a lot about also just being welcoming in our classrooms, and what can we do to show them that we celebrate them and we celebrate their culture and this gift of language.
Yeah, language is culture.
And I would add to that, I appreciate and love what Lindsay said, and add the parents as well, and reassure the parents that that's fantastic that you are speaking multi-languages, right? So obviously they're speaking another language at home, oftentimes with the student, and to make sure that they know that's okay and you're great with it. You think it's fantastic. And none of this, oh dear, you're speaking too much of the other language, that oftentimes might be, some people, they have that idea and it just isn't true. And making sure that we're not perpetuating that, because that really isn't true, of acquiring another language, and being supportive of the parents as well.
It's true. And some parents do feel like, oh, I can't encourage our first language because they won't learn English, and really helping them to understand that's not the case. So I'm having very fond memories of my time in first grade. And I had a student named Eduardo who is from Mexico, and his mother would visit Mexico frequently. And she'd always bring back games or candy, and we always gave that airtime in my classroom. And my students were actually learning Spanish, not formally, because I can only speak Spanish in the present tense, but we were learning vocabulary words in Spanish. And I remember, and you guys, I don't even know, maybe we edit this out, but when I was in high school Spanish, we started every class period by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in Spanish. Why? I do not know. I feel like it's an interesting activity, but whatever. But I learned it. I can, to this day, with a high level of accuracy, repeat the Pledge of Allegiance in Spanish. I will not do that because my pronunciation isn't great. But in my first grade classroom, whenever I wanted my students' attention, sometimes I would just start reciting the Pledge of Allegiance in Spanish. And it's amazing how many students will listen to you when they don't understand what you're saying, right? Like, she's speaking a whole different language. Well, I remember the first time I did that, and Eduardo was working with a group of students. All of a sudden he pops up his head. Hey, I know what you're saying. And all of my students were like, you do? Like it was some big, great thing. And I did. I celebrated that. Yes, he does. And there goes my secret language because Eduardo knows it. And so it became just a really cool thing in our classroom, and part of that culture too. He was able to bring it in. We talked about differences in holidays for his parents and grandparents and for him. So lots of great things to celebrate, lots of really great things that can be added to a classroom when you have students who are learning English as not their first language, right? So many great possibilities. So thank you today for our conversation. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you were just dying to say? No. Okay. Donna and Lindsay are shaking their head no. So on that note, we will thank you again for joining us for this episode. Feel free to share with us any ideas that you have, anything that's worked for you with MLs, and then take advantage of all the resources that we're going to be listing in the show notes, because there are a lot of them for this episode. And we hope to see you on the next episode of Literacy Talks.
Thanks for joining us today. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Visit readinghorizons.com/literacy talks to access episodes and resources to support your journey in the science of reading.